Metal Gear is a series of action games best defined by their lack of action, with that ethos becoming the guiding theme for its over 35-year-long history. In that 35 years, its thread of anti-war and anti-nuke sentiment has become more and more tangled, twisted in with postmodern narratives about information control, groundbreaking translations of cinematic language to video games, thematically rich gameplay mechanics, and much more. It's been stretched and contorted from small linear 2D experiences to vast 3D open worlds, along the way spun off into avenues of side series, novels and merchandise to name a few. All the while its world and story has been jumped in and out of over a 50-year period, growing in complexity and scope. So when you look back today, that single thread now looks more like a web. It can be hard to parse and understand. So if we're to analyse the first two titles today, and eventually, hopefully, all the mainline games as time goes on, it's best to start right at the beginning. For most video game franchises, you'd instinctively and correctly head to the very first release, but part of what makes Metal Gear so unique is that instead you head to its creator, Hideo Kojima. Born in 1963, Kojima developed a love of cinema early on in his life. His family moved around when he was quite young, and they soon began a tradition of watching a different movie each night. The shock of the environmental change from moving caused him to become more reclusive, films naturally slotting in as a passion. By 10, he was being encouraged by his parents to see movies by himself, and not long after he was making movies with his friends on an 8mm camcorder. Despite being around friends, he often felt lonely, comforted by movies like Taxi Driver, relating to the loneliness and alienation the protagonist Travis Bickle felt, though given the content of Kojima's games, perhaps not the violence so much. When he was 13, his father passed away, making him feel more alone, but at once more determined to realize his goal of making movies. Despite this ambition, he ended up studying economics at university, though eventually dropped out to join the games industry. He doesn't characterize this as settling for a different medium, but instead working with what was in front of him, spotting potential in the medium for artistic expression. He joined Konami as that was the only video game company listed on the stock exchange, a symbol of legitimacy that he thought may make his change in direction seem more serious and viable. His first project was Lost World for the MSX, though it was cancelled after just 6 months. His next game was Metal Gear. Konami wanted a war game, but Kojima instead looked for a way to subvert that, taking inspiration from The Great Escape to make a game based around avoiding action rather than actively seeking it out. From what I've already mentioned, you can see key points of Metal Gear's themes that have been taken from Kojima's own life, helping him craft experiences that feel like his, which is what's significant. Sure, in the 90s some people knew who Shigeru Miyamoto, John Romero or John Carmack were, I stress some, but the games they made didn't quite feel singularly theirs, or like they were exploring their ideas alone. In contrast, you can see Kojima's fingerprints all over the main Metal Gear games. He felt somewhat comforted when joining Konami, as so many of his colleagues, like him, felt that video games had offered them a second chance. They were outsiders or people who hadn't quite made it the first time, and Kojima used that to his advantage. His lifelong love of film had translated to a keen focus on imagery and symbols. You can see this even in his personal life. When discussing Death Stranding with Adrian Chen for a piece in the New York Times, he brings up one of the initial images that came to him, that of a man naked, stranded on a beach. He then relates this to his own position at the time, having recently left Konami to go independent, feeling naked himself. You get the impression from reading that this was impromptu and sudden, not a connection he dwelled on before, and to me this shows a sort of innate understanding of how imagery can be used to bridge moments and emotions together. This skill has helped him apply a guiding consistency to interactive experiences in a way very few people had done before, so by the time Metal Gear Solid came out in '98, he really stuck out as one of video games' first auteurs. This makes him and his work a really fascinating subject to cover, and hopefully by looking at the inception point of this thread turned web, we can properly analyse his main piece of work, starting before things get too tangled with Metal Gear 1 and 2. You can see glimpses of his authorship even right in the beginning. When left on the title screen, a gameplay preview highlights Snake avoiding a guard to pick up an item. and after that it shows Big Boss relaying the game's controls to Snake over radio. The game's identity is present immediately, with its focus on stealth and non-violence, and then the self-referential, quirky tone via a very self-serious character like Big Boss, repeating MSX controls to the game's main character. It's distinct in a unique way to many other games of the time. Upon starting up, we see rookie Foxhound operative Snake swimming up to a terrorist base called Outer Heaven, ready to begin Operation Intrude N313, which is to take out Metal Gear, an incredibly powerful weapon. All this is communicated by the aforementioned Big Boss, who, I'm sure you can tell by the name, is the leader of Foxhound. Snake's first order of business is to contact Grey Fox, one of the organization's top agents who recently went missing, in the process hopefully ascertaining more about Metal Gear. Finally, you're given a transceiver code you can use to contact Big Boss at any time. Much like the title screen, this introduction feels very deliberate. It's obviously giving you the basic rundown of your mission, but what comes after is where it shines. Once in control of Snake, you notice the only thing in his inventory is a packet of cigarettes. It's a way for Kojima to characterize Snake as a peer of iconic action movie heroes, the type of person who, in dangerous situations, prioritizes his need to have a smoke above all, endlessly aloof and in control. He is only a rookie and follows orders, but is clearly not overly deferential, retaining a personality of his own. Then, conversely, on the other side of the screen you see rank and health, both of which are quite low. It's almost displaying his perception of himself, his outwards appearance, and then the reality of the situation. When both things are taken together, it's setting up that these things will be reconciled as his mission progresses. In terms of his appearance, well, there's not too much to go off, but in the transceiver screen you can continue to see Kojima's love of movies coming through. His character portrait is grimy and made up of brown tones, with the exceptions of his eyes, which are strikingly blue, a sort of marker that despite being in a callous situation, he's still an all-American boy with a heart of gold, kind of like these action heroes who massacre people for 90 minutes, with the reminder that they're doing it for all the right reasons. Though of course Snake himself will go on to subvert that. It's also the same colour eyes of Kurt Russell, who Snake was based off of, named after Snake Plissken, who Russell played in Escape from New York. Beyond character work like this, there's some good design as well. The first couple screens are lined with massive unmanned tanks pointed directly at you, a reminder that you won't survive by trying to gun everything down. They have the advantage over you. It then softly introduces the core of sneaking. The next screen north has a line of crates right in front of you, forcing you to stop in your tracks, while at the same time the two guards in the room happen to be walking towards you. This makes the player give pause and properly observe the pattern of movement, which is the core understanding you need to avoid being spotted. By hitting N or M on your totally legitimate MSX2 keyboard, you can punch. It doesn't feel great to do, kinda sluggish and stiff, but it's pretty forgiving. The range is surprisingly generous and enemies are stunned by it, which makes taking one out with a 3-hit combo pretty breezy. Guards themselves have a very literal line of sight, like just a line in front of them, no cone of vision or anything, so avoiding them is generally easy, but at the same time narrow areas and pretty constant movement on their part helps things feel a bit trickier. Another design choice here is that if you get spotted in this room, you only get a minor alert, shown via a single exclamation point, rather than a major alert, shown via a double exclamation point. Getting rid of a minor alert simply takes leaving the current room, so you're not really punished at all within this first encounter. As you go beyond this initial room, you realise there's no real direction. You know the name of who you're looking for, but no hint as to where he may be, so it's time to explore. As you look around and sneak past guards, the music feels like it accentuates your movements. The insistent thumping kicks resemble your steps on the hard floor, with drawn-out melodies over top that evoke sequences of sneaking in the shadows. Before the alert music kicks in, feeling much hastier but still tonally similar. This, combined with your lack of true direction and abstracted, detached mode of communication, does cultivate the sensation of being alone in this facility. The situation feels dire and risky, a pretty good sense of atmosphere to capture all the way back in '87. This sustains for a while as you pick up the level 1 keycard, binoculars to see in surrounding rooms, rations for healing, and a pistol, soon after using the elevator to go up a level and eventually find the first POW of the game, which is when things sort of turned for the worse. As you find and rescue POWs throughout Outer Heaven, your rank, or class, will increase, in turn increasing your max health. Quite late in the game, one of the characters will only help you out if you have a class of 4 stars, requiring you to save 20 POWs. Every time you kill a POW, your rank decreases by 1 permanently, so what this does is put a lot of pressure on the player to find as many POWs as they can. If you don't, you'll be dealing with a lot of back and forth trying to get your rank up, and if you kill one, you may softlock the game altogether, with there being no way to get your rank back up to get the character's help. This pressure coincides with the game's stunted progression. After rescuing the first POW, you exit to the right, only to be sustaining damage. Big Boss calls you to say that you'll need a gas mask to mitigate the effects of gaseous rooms. The gas mask is all the way back near the entrance, down 1 level. This isn't a massive deal now, but so much of Metal Gear's critical path is made up of this sort of stuff, and when each room resets once you leave it, backtracking like this becomes very frustrating. Wading through the same rooms and patterns over and over again is exhausting and frankly boring. As you get further into the adventure, the ground you've covered expands, and so this backtracking gets worse and worse, especially as some needless limitations are put onto you, like some elevators only being able to move one fucking way. The reason I bring these multitude of issues up is because it creates an experience that practically necessitates use of a guide to enjoy it. I was reticent to do just that, seeing as I was making a video on the game, and I'd already finished Metal Gear 1 once before, but as one of my notes aptly puts it, quote, "I forgot how fucked this game is." So I did use a guide, and I'm very grateful for that choice, because as I said, these issues only grow as you progress, and I could not imagine finishing this game without some help. It would be miserable. There are some positives hidden within this. The gunplay is quite stilted and cumbersome, but appropriately so. You forever feel under-equipped and outmatched. It reinforces much of the game's focus, while still getting the job done in a pinch. Revisiting rooms isn't always bad. Many have different layouts depending on where you approach from, not only shaking up the art of stealth, but demonstrating an understanding of the playing experience, so that you're not unfairly spotted just because you entered the room via a different direction. The game also regularly switches things up. You never spend too long just sneaking past basic guards. The gas-filled room is emblematic of that, and a little later on there's a room with an electrified floor with a control panel that you need to find, and then use a remote-controlled missile on to allow passage. Along the way, one of the POWs you rescue informs you that a Foxhound agent, presumably Grey Fox, is still alive, though being held by the terrorists, letting you know that you're at least headed in the right direction. Moving deeper into the facility, you get the frequency for Diane, a member of the Resistance, and not long after, the beloved cardboard box. The cardboard box is a great distillation of Kojima's mark on this series, evident right at its inception. Not only is it so goofy visually and conceptually, but it adds a lot to gameplay. Nothing can spot you if you're stationary while you wear it, but if seen moving with it on, an alert will be wrong. It's still very helpful, but also changes the parameters of stealth and visibility. The way you navigate each space is changed by its rules and limitations. You can be more ostentatious in your actions, but you still need to exercise some restraint, as stopping in a guard's path is a ticket to getting caught. It recontextualizes the main thrust of gameplay in a really simple but clever way. Beyond that, like I said, it's a great symbol for the series' charm. There's inherent humor and absurdity to it, but the game never highlights that. Characters don't joke about it or anything, and part of what makes Metal Gear so unique is the sincerity with which it treats its surrealism and absurdity. The game's adherence to self-seriousness not only injects further comedy, but creates a world in which these strange things are simply accepted, allowing the player to do the same and take the game's themes at face value. It crafts an understanding that the serious thematic content is to be analysed and discussed, while trusting that the player will see the charm and personality in its sillier details. While continuing to explore Outer Heaven, you find POWs who let you know that Grey Fox is being held in solitary confinement, and that the best way to get to him is to be purposefully caught. It's a cool idea, subverting the status quo of gameplay while tying into the thematic role of Snake and the terrorists. The terrorists' brutal, violent methods are ultimately short-sighted and full of holes, ready for primarily non-violent actors like Snake to take advantage of. It's furthering the dynamic around violence within the text in a way that plays off of gameplay, creating equivalence between non-violence and intelligence, and violence and ignorance. Once put in solitary, Snake is able to, somehow, punch down the wall between the two cells, finally reaching Grey Fox. He reveals just what Metal Gear is, a bipedal tank that has the capability of firing nuclear warheads from any terrain or position. It's practically a monument to war, to violence, the ultimate weapon that can remotely wipe out any perceived enemy with one command, free from any limitations. It's also an interesting middle ground of human and machine. It is a mechanical metal weapon but derives its greatest evolution, or asset, its legs, from people, or organic life generally. It's an exaggerated idea, but one that within the game's world could only be executed by humans. Our mark is irreparably left on it despite the detached position it allows its users to take. Its design feels deliberate, meant to evoke the human touch and creation that war as we know it is. That connection allows for a blatant, if simple point to be derived. War is bad, which hey, this is a pretty great way to communicate that in a video game for this time. The final thing Grey Fox tells Snake is that the only one who knows how to destroy Metal Gear is its developer, Dr. Petrovich. Petrovich's name sounds like it originates from Eastern Europe, but at the same time, Outer Heaven is in Africa, and the Resistance members are American, leading you to believe the other terrorists are too. This range of nationalities feels intentional, so as to paint the themes as a general sentiment that forgoes borders and alliances. Leaving to find Petrovich, Snake faces the first boss of the game, Shoot Gunner. Yeah, his name is Shoot Gunner. He's nothing special, just a victim of his own passion, I suppose, as you just gotta shoot him with lots of your guns to defeat him. The next major obstacle is this massive spiral room where you have to destroy certain walls to progress, at the same time picking up some items. This area really demonstrates a larger problem with the game. Earlier I complimented Metal Gear's insistence on regularly changing things up, but it can often fall apart, like here. On paper, it makes sense to have an area where you use the punching walls trick from earlier with Grey Fox to figure out what parts to destroy to progress. The player is taking a lesson learned from earlier to forge onwards, but there's been a failure to account for whether that's actually fun. Many things in Metal Gear 1 have clearly been thought out to an extent, but most of it's never taken that step further to truly consider whether it's fun or satisfying. As I've just said, the spiral room makes some sense on paper, but in practice it's tedious, and the items you can find here don't make exploring it any easier. For example, finding some pouch that lets you carry more plastic explosives would encourage you to explore more, as you'd have more chances to blow up walls with an expanded capacity. But that extra step in many cases is never taken, leading to much of the experience feeling aggravating and extraneous, despite its efforts to keep the playthrough fresh. Thanks to some more saved POWs, Snake learns that Petrovich is in the courtyard, but it takes a parachute jump from the roof of the building to get there, so that's the next objective. In the meantime, you have to face off against Machine Gun Kid, which it's nice to see that Kojima's tradition of the most on-the-nose names possible begun so early in his career. Hot Coldman and Die Hardman are in good company. That being said, there is something to the names of these first two bosses, I think. As dumb as they are, and they are very dumb, they show people sort of enamored with weapons and violence, to the point of making it their namesake, another way to communicate the dichotomy between the heroes and villains. Snake slithers amongst the shadows to remain unseen, avoiding violence, while the villains appear obsessed with it, leading to an abomination like Metal Gear. Snake successfully gets to the roof and parachutes down to where Petrovich is being kept, but finds that he's too late. The doctor has already been moved to a different location. Fortunately, a nearby POW lets you know that Petrovich has been carted off to Building 2, 10 k's north across the desert. Using an enemy uniform you picked up earlier, thanks to the guide, in order to avoid the protracted backtracking now, you infiltrate Building 2. You soon come face to face with this massive bulldozer thing, which brings me back to the theme of these boss fights. The two bosses prior to this are also massive machines, a Hindy helicopter and a tank. This is coming after the initial pair of human bosses. The evolution of boss fights feels like it's playing into the chimera of mechanics and humanity that I touched on with Metal Gear's design. These bosses, though tough on their own, are nothing compared to Metal Gear, which is practically all these encounters put into one. Unfortunately, all these bosses are either unremarkable or unfun, but they do at least serve a thematic purpose, while reinforcing the danger Metal Gear presents, building motivation somewhat. This ramping up of boss fights feels in step with the game at large. You can see a keen attempt to try and craft legitimate action sequences, like those of a film. Fighting the airborne troopers on the roof only to parachute down, dodging missiles and mines while you navigate a desolate desert. Mandatory combat becomes more present here too, with room layouts that feel more purposefully built to catch you up and trigger alerts. I do really respect this ambition, but the game just doesn't have the facilities to pull it off. You can see Kojima's want to translate raucous, tense action movie moments into a video game pressing up against the limitations of the time and systems he's designed. Looking at it more obliquely though, this is at least a good sign. He's trying to inject more of a distinct, comprehensive narrative structure into a medium that up to this point had not seemed to really care about such a thing. Which is not inherently bad. The ambition of video games should not be to merely emulate other mediums, but you can see how Kojima would go on to be someone who helped push video game storytelling as he at least had a better understanding of how to tell stories back in '87 than the majority of people developing at the time, even if it never quite comes to fruition here. While exploring Building 2, Snake comes across a fake Petrovich, who reveals that the real Doctor is on Floor 2, then attempting to trap the Foxhound agent. Snake evades capture and picks up Keycard 6, coming into contact with Flame Trooper, a man who failed to account for someone being able to stand to his right and rapidly pump lead directly into his stomach. Deeper into Building 2, a POW gives you the frequency for Jennifer, a Resistance member, though she will only respond if you have a class of 4. This is the point where if you haven't saved enough POWs, you need to go and find some more. Or even worse, if you've killed 1 or 2, most likely your save's ruined and you have to start over again. Snake soon finds the real Petrovich, though he won't give up any details about Metal Gear until you've saved his daughter, Ellen, who's been taken hostage. Back to Building 1 it is. After dealing with some very obnoxious traps, you make it to Ellen and free her. Then of course you have to get all the way back to Petrovich again. He explains that Metal Gear is 100 levels below ground in Building 3, which is 20 kilometers north of Building 2. The key to destroying the mech is targeting its legs with explosives, though it must be done in a very specific order. As you get closer to Metal Gear, things begin ramping up. Big Boss starts relaying misleading orders, and calls from Resistance members like Jennifer and Schneider become more regular. Schneider calls at one point after finding out the identity of the leader at Outer Heaven, but he's taken out before he can reveal it. As things near the end, it does feel more dangerous, and you're putting a decent amount of the rather sizable inventory you've built to use. There's a pretty good sense of finality and culmination. It strikes you that the feeling of isolation has thawed out a little, and the Resistance feels more palpable as a force and presence within the base thanks to their help with getting some items. This anticipation comes to a head when a POW gives you the answer Schneider couldn't earlier. Outer Heaven's leader is actually Big Boss himself. I wouldn't say this is a terribly affecting reveal, but it is an integral one to Metal Gear's identity as a series, and is foreshadowed by those sabotage orders you were receiving earlier. It's also turned in on itself as Big Boss calls, and actually tells Snake to turn off the MSX. The fourth wall isn't just broken, but the characters themselves are told to reach past it and into our own world. This decision casually bends the reality of a game that's otherwise rather serious in its tone. This comes back to the fact that Metal Gear often plays its weirdness straight. What makes this style of self-awareness so effective is it's not winking or nudging the player. It doesn't think it's cute, but rather understands its ability to challenge how we see the narrative and world. Up until this point, we've essentially done whatever Big Boss said, likely to the point of getting caught up a few times thanks to the purposefully incorrect directions he begins giving. And so here he's taking it one step further, hoping that Snake, and by extension the player, have been molded to blindly follow orders enough to completely give up via turning off the system. It doesn't work, of course, but that's a really cool idea, and way more interesting than using the fourth wall as a surface to bounce dumb jokes off of. Approaching the room where Metal Gear lays, things truly come full circle. The final doors all use the level 1 keycard, emphasizing that this is coming to an end, while at the same time being housed in much more aggressive rooms. Electric floors that can't be turned off and a combination of gas and mines makes things way more dangerous, continuing to contribute to that finality. At last, Snake enters the room with Metal Gear, though the fight is underwhelming in a sense. It's not actually turned on, you're just placing explosives at its feet while trying to avoid laser turrets. I do like the idea of having to place the explosives in a specific pattern, trying to communicate the idea that this thing is a complex machine that can only be stopped by an intricate order of attack, but it's not terribly exciting. With the machine at last destroyed, a self-destruct sequence begins. First, you have to take out Big Boss. He explains that he let a rookie like Snake take on this mission in the hopes he could feed him wrong information and keep Big Boss's involvement with Outer Heaven secret, though Snake ended up prevailing. He skitters back and forth, but is no match for Snake's rockets, soon falling. It's a race against the clock to escape, though Snake can give himself more time by smoking his cigarettes, playing off his established characterization. He narrowly makes it out, Outer Heaven exploding behind him. Snake reports his mission a success, and we see the local news report on the explosion, believing it to be an earthquake. Once the credits have rolled, there's one last transmission from Big Boss, stating that he will see Solid Snake again, and that things aren't finished yet. That's Metal Gear. It certainly has a ton of problems, and I wouldn't ever recommend playing it without following along with a guide, but there's still a lot of value here. It establishes way more of the series' identity than you may initially expect, and makes valiant, if generally unsuccessful, attempts to inject a game with greater narrative depth and substance. You can see Kojima's love of movies bleed through all over the place, but these influences are hampered by frustrating systems, an aggravating critical path, and rudimentary technology. Still, the thematic content is impressive for the time and has more consistency and cogency than you'd expect given the stilted and disconnected writing. It's not a game I enjoy all that much, but it's certainly one I respect, and remains an interesting part of the history of one of gaming's most important stories. Fortunately, things would improve with the next game. Kojima didn't initially intend to create a sequel until running into a fellow Konami employee on the train. This developer informed him that a sequel for the NES version of Metal Gear was being developed. He hadn't had any involvement in that original NES version of Metal Gear and hadn't been contacted about its sequel either. So he was encouraged to create his own, and supposedly had the game's premise down by the end of the train ride. It was quite successful in Japan upon its release in 1990, also receiving critical acclaim. I previously played the version present on Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence, but this time I'm emulating an English fan translated ROM. This is also what I did for Metal Gear 1, as I figured I could use my prior experience with both games as a reference in regards to official scripts, as well as just looking at playthroughs online if need be, and these new playthroughs to get an experience more akin to that at release, being able to use an actual keyboard as was done for MSX games. Metal Gear 2's leaping quality in many different facets can be seen right away. The filmic title sequence is emblematic of Kojima's influences. These influences are used to great effect as there's a sense of intrigue built through the focus on Metal Gear being constructed. This also emphasizes the complexity and importance of the weapon, conjuring up a begrudging respect for its build quality that develops into a more impressed understanding of the threat it poses. At the same time, this technical marvel is being constructed as the names of developers fade in and out, creating a thread between those who crafted the game experience and flexing the fourth wall a little. The music underscores this brilliantly. The bloopy primary melody highlights the developmental technical sides of Metal Gear, while the crunchy buzzy kicks portray the reality of it, evoking its impactful steps. A synth lead then comes in and out to characterize the weaving between the two that the player will embody, sneaking amongst the possibility and reality of this weapon and war in an attempt to prevent them all. As all the pieces come together, the energy of the song is amped up, finally grounded by a single dread-filled note over top the title screen. This all sets the groundwork for the prologue which plays afterwards. With the Cold War ended in the 90s, nuclear threat has been eliminated. However, Zanzibar Land, a small country in Central Asia, establishes a military government. It soon begins raiding nuclear disposal sites, concentrating nuclear power in their hands. While this is happening, an oil crisis is mounting thanks to shortages. Dr. Kyo Marv is able to develop Oilix, a microorganism capable of secreting high-quality oil, presenting a solution. Marv is then kidnapped by Zanzibar Land, the military nation now posing a threat to the world. The increase in production value continues, with detailed vignettes of weapons, jewelry, and Snake himself underscoring the text. This is also, as you probably noticed, a much more involved setup than Metal Gear 1, and the narrative content here feels much more in step with Kojima's later works. This first comes in a better established historical context. At the time it was looking forward, as the Soviet Union was yet to be dissolved, bringing with it the end of the Cold War at the game's release, but the acknowledging of evolving geopolitics as informing the game's events and circumstances is deeper than Metal Gear 1. This ability to so specifically plant a fictional story within a non-fiction setting is present across the rest of the series, and gives the creators room to play and explore, dipping in and out of plausible reality whenever they feel like it. This dynamic comes into play keenly with Oilix. This is an entirely fictional substance, but one meant to implicate more complicated world problems, ones hinged around the interdependence of nations, imperialism, and crises around natural resources. The vast majority of games around this time, including Metal Gear 1, would see Zanzibar Land and Metal Gear itself as enough to set up the story. Those two things serve the purpose of explaining why Snake has to go on this mission to save the world. But Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake takes that a step further with Oilix, having greater thematic ambition than its peers and previous incarnations. Beyond the literal content of the game, this prologue highlights a point in Kojima's, and the people he'd work with, development. There's a touch of naivete here, seeming to believe that the end of the Cold War would also mean the end of nuclear threat. However, later Metal Gear games would focus again and again on this being a total lie, on nations purposely failing to uphold nuclear disarmament pacts and agreements. There's always been palpable conviction behind Kojima's anti-nuke sentiment, and so it's interesting to see how that may have formed. Perhaps feeling resentful of the lies these leaders told about their commitment to dissolution of nuclear weapons, the weapons that had ravaged swaths of his home country just 18 years before he was born. With the 2 intro sequences complete, the game begins, with Snake entering Zanzibar Land. Colonel Campbell, Snake's officer at Foxhound, briefs you on the mission, called Operation Intrude FO14. The mission is to sneak into Zanzibar Land proper and then rescue Keo Marv. The most important part of Campbell's little monologue is his explanation of the radar. It shows you the geography and enemy movement in a 3x3 grid, of which Snake is in the center of. The radar here is much like the cardboard box of MG1. The cardboard box was a substitution of freedom, lessening the pressure in some areas but having the potential to dial it up in others. This made it a compelling tool that was satisfying to use effectively. The radar does the same, as it in some ways makes it easy to execute stealth, making sure to be observant of guard movements. But at the same time, the radar allows the game to get away with NPC pathing and room layout that's more complex and layered. This creates that same dynamic as the box, where it's a net positive if you make proper use of it, but can cause you to get caught more if you're not careful. Thankfully, Metal Gear 2 makes its first chunk of screens a learning curve, much like Metal Gear 1. It kinda assumes you've already played Metal Gear 1, not bothering with the most basic aspects of gameplay in Metal Gear 2 because of how similar they are to the previous title, so likewise I won't repeat them here. With this assumption, it instead pushes focus towards teaching the player to consider the radar. Narrow passageways amongst this little maze of fences can lead to dead ends, which makes following one of them a guarantor for getting caught. This is teaching you to stop and take time to observe the radar, see where paths lead, take into account enemy movement around them, and make a judgment about whether there may be a helpful item up there, and if there is, if the risk is worth it. The radar is a fantastic addition that solves the problem of being surprised by guard locations when you enter a screen, substituting that frustration with a further emphasis on player observation to enhance the feeling of stealth overall. With that said, it seems like it could then pull focus away from the main game. Why not just stare at the abstracted but omniscient radar the whole time? Well, MG2 comes in with a solve via the ability to crawl along the ground. By hitting N and M at the same time, which is effective enough but at times cumbersome, Snake will crouch. Upon moving, he will then crawl, allowing him to hide under obstacles, crawl through holes and gaps, or avoid making noise on different surfaces. This then refocuses the player's attention on the actual game, as those things can't be seen on the radar. Beyond acting as a way to cement a player's engagement with their tools, this also makes stealth interactions more dynamic. Alert phases are no longer as dire or definitive, and Zanzibar Land overall feels deeper and realer. A fence with a hole in it makes sense. It now effectively reads as a fence, rather than a block of single-coloured pixels that stop Snake from moving forward, which is how objects could feel in Metal Gear 1. The radar and crouching are 2 major gameplay additions, and are what really inform the litany of other small improvements. The bones of gameplay remain largely the same from Metal Gear 1, and as such so does the thread of non-violence and by extension anti-war theming. I won't bring this up as much for Metal Gear 2 for the sake of not repeating myself, but it's worth establishing that all the thematic aspects of gameplay in Metal Gear 1 carry over to this game. Conversely, the presentation and level design aspects of the intro deviate from that original title. I've already covered how the design of these initial screens differ, so let's move on to presentation. Whereas in Metal Gear 1, Kojima used the cigarettes and distinct blue eyes of Snake's portrait to establish his character, Metal Gear 2 takes a shortcut by making Snake just straight up look like one of those action heroes. In this case, Mel Gibson. This happens across the game with different characters, and it really does feel like a shortcut. On one hand, it's just another stupid thing Kojima does that I find more endearing than lazy, but on the other, it stops these characters from feeling original, and it especially feels wrong if you've played later games. These portraits were only used in the MSX original. Later ports use likenesses taken from the Solid games and Ghost Babel, and I do prefer them for obvious reasons. Beyond name characters, I think the presence of guards right at the beginning is important. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, like the name suggests, focuses way more on the people behind war and geopolitical conflict than just the conflict itself, and the guards represent this. Think back to Metal Gear 1, where the first things you saw were massive tanks, meant to dissuade you from engaging in violence while acting as symbols of war. Instead, we now have people. Generic, nameless guards, sure, but people nonetheless. Like the first intro sequence, the supremacy and danger machines of war present is still highlighted, as tanks are the first thing you see when entering the Zanzibar building. Snake soon receives a call from Holly Wyatt, who snuck into Zanzibar Land as a journalist the month prior. She'll provide support when you call her, giving you some direction or hints as to what to do next. The fact that she actually properly introduces herself is a step up from MG1 and continues the larger focus on character. The initial area does a good job of establishing gameplay evolutions, and this first floor of the Zanzibar building keeps that up. As I said, the radar allows for more complex enemy movement and room layouts. This in turn necessitates screens that naturally feed into each other and feel connected. A benefit of this is that the different areas are made more memorable. Having to digest rooms on a 3x3 basis means that you commit them to memory easier, with the more detailed graphics creating further distinctions between the different locations as well. As a result, backtracking is not as painful in Metal Gear 2, and it generally feels like you can get around without assistance from a guide. I say generally because a guide is still quite helpful at different times and backtracking can still get pretty bad, but in comparison to Metal Gear 1, the level design has been improved structurally while at the same time not sacrificing moment-to-moment fun. This is exemplified by this first floor. Its main area is not much more than a 3x3 grid of screens and acts as a central location for the critical path. As you explore it, you better understand how gameplay has changed, and in particular how that pertains to progression. However, possibly because of how much more is going on, the game appears to run quite poorly. You can see this when Snake moves into an elevator. His movement speed increases, presumably because the game doesn't have to render anything but the elevator itself. Later on, I did bump the emulator's resolution down, and I think that helped somewhat, but it still wasn't great. The lower resolution also doesn't look that great, but it's more authentic at least. I bring it up because it does dampen gameplay somewhat. Control can often feel sluggish and unresponsive, the disconnect between you and Snake making alert sequences or bosses in particular frustrating. While looking around, you pick up a handgun, and on the second floor the first keycard as well as the binoculars. This is the same set of initial items as Metal Gear 1, and shows you that the game's priorities of stealth and non-violence are fully intact here. Taking the elevator to floor 3, you pick up the trusty gas mask and spot Kyo Marv on the radar, marked by the red dot as Campbell established earlier. However, it turns out to be someone called Black Ninja. This is a pretty classic Metal Gear boss fight. The limited combat options make things pretty cumbersome, and you're kinda just best off taking some hits and mashing the fire button. After taking enough bullets, the ninja reveals himself to be Schneider, who provided support back in Operation Intrude and 313. Schneider explains that after Snake defeated Metal Gear, NATO bombed the base, killing even innocents and children there. NATO wanted to cover up the existence of the children at Outer Heaven who were orphans of war. Snake struggles to come to terms with the betrayal as Schneider explains that someone in Outer Heaven was able to give the survivors a home and family again via Zanzibar land. If the anti-war and violence theming of Metal Gear 1 established one half of the series' narrative genome, then this encounter completes it. Metal Gear 2 continues to focus on people and perspective here, adding nuance through the bombings while, like in the introduction, using real-world forces like NATO as ways to legitimize the content. Invoking NATO in particular is notable as that then invokes bombings by the organization that would happen after the game's release, like those in Yugoslavia in 1999 and Libya in 2011, both of which took civilian lives. This speech takes the events of the previous game and extrapolates on them geopolitically to create a greyer narrative landscape than the series has ever housed before. It's taking what was presented as individual and making it systematic. The game simultaneously understands why stories have characters and villains, using Schneider as the delivery vehicle as the player has an established, no matter how little, relationship with him. What he says here then has more impact, particularly for Snake as a character who up until this point has sort of represented the narrative complexity of the series. This reveal shatters his preconceptions and naivete, finding it hard to reconcile reality with his simple, propagandized ideal of war. This monologue by Schneider injects the ambiguity we'd see in the series when it comes to the sides of war and its consequences, firmly seals the comparisons and analogues of real-world events, and does so via a pre-established character to always be pulling at familiar and known emotional threads. These things are hallmarks of the series' writing, and so seeing them established here is very cool. This of course also bolsters the anti-war content, causing you to question what makes an enemy and how the agendas of states and governments often disregard human life in their pursuit of victory, built off an imperialist idea of domination and dehumanization. We again see betrayal being brought up like in the lies around nuclear disarmament from earlier, and then a focus on family and paternal figures and the cruelty of someone being robbed of them. These two things mirror Kojima, first in the connection to nuclear bombings in Japan, but then in his loneliness growing up and later the passing of his father. As all-encompassing as the ideas being tackled here can appear, they ultimately can be honed down to individuals themselves, the game making sure not to lose sight of that. In his final words, Schneider tells Snake how to get to Marv, as there's no real bad blood between them, before a very touching and respectful send-off. Getting to Marv involves following a green beret through the jungle and showcases an improved ability to gamify stealth. Metal Gear 1 attempted to build action set pieces to create peaks and valleys in its pace and spectacle, but what this failed to do was really augment gameplay or play to its strengths. As such, they felt out of step with the game's general tone. Metal Gear 2 instead then creates distinct moments by implementing stealth, like here in the jungle. Additionally, this method makes each area stand out more, so when you do have to backtrack, that process is made easier. Having successfully followed the green beret, you enter the shack where Marv is supposed to be. However, there's a wall between the two of you, and using Marv's tapping as well as a legend on the manual, you can decode a frequency to call him on. Like the end of Metal Gear 1, it's blurring the line between the player and protagonist, calling into question that connection and the reality of the game. While the series is making a concerted effort to bind itself to world events and geopolitics more, it's also keeping these elements of unreality and fourth wall breaking. There's a toying with legitimacy, with what can and can't happen that's interesting. It's refusing to plant its feet, instead dancing around the idea in a compelling way. Upon making the call, the man on the other side of the wall isn't Marv, but in fact Petrovich, from Metal Gear 1. He's also been caught, but is able to tell you that Marv's being housed in the tower building to the north. Additionally, Snake learns that the man behind Zanzibar Land is Big Boss. This of course adds lots of personal motivation for Snake as a character, but also contributes to the focus on familiar people within this expanded scope. Big Boss is fucking nuts, wanting to take the world hostage via Metal Gear and Oilix, but he's also someone who seemed to look out for people who were made purposeless by war. He has this paradoxical outlook on war that sort of plays into the inherent absurdity of the idea. Before heading to the tower building, Snake takes care of Running Man, a boss who, you guessed it, runs. He really doesn't matter. What's important is that you get the third keycard. While crossing the desert, you get some help from a mysterious fan and destroy, yet again, a Hind helicopter, this time with remote-controlled missiles. Shortly after entering the tower building with the help of the trusty cardboard box, you're contacted by Holly, who's been captured and placed down in the sewer. The music in the sewer is much slower than that of Zanzibar or tower building, using a whining, sickly extended note to punctuate the seediness of the dank tunnels, with a more refreshing, bubbling melody that cuts out to further emphasize how disgusting this sewer is, Holly being debased in a sense. Once she's found, the music becomes more wistful and nostalgic, almost sounding like a harmonica, bringing to mind emotional folk songs. She managed to find out that Marv had let out a carrier pigeon with his frequency on it, and that it's circling the roof of the tower building. Amongst that is this weird thread of Holly feeling useless and Snake being unable to contain how attracted to her he is, which firmly establishes a trend of the series. Women are often described but rarely portrayed as capable or skilled. They're melodramatic and repeatedly judged first and foremost by how appealing they are sexually to the male characters that surround them. There are exceptions here and there throughout the games, but they're unfortunately rare, and this consistent characterization of the female characters is typically subverted to prove what the creators assume the player's perspective will be, that women obviously have less value in these types of narratives. Although the intent here can be good, it still ultimately disallows these women from being full characters. But I'll touch on this more as we go. In this instance, you more see the beginnings of it. While ascending the tower building, Snake fends off Red Blaster, later blowing off the door and stepping out onto the roof. Upon catching the pigeon and calling Marv, you find out that he doesn't speak English. Petrovich informs you that Natasha, or Gustava in officially localized versions, an STB agent who escorted Petrovich into Zanzibar Land, should be able to translate the Czech and Slovak of Marv. This kind of highlights a problem in that the game often feels like it's running off one perpetual objective. I really love the wide narrative focus, but in terms of concrete objectives, Marv remains it for practically the entire game. It robs the experience from a sense of accomplishment and to some extent purpose. Being invested in finding Marv is tough when it feels inevitable that the next lead will turn up dry. You eventually find Natasha in the women's restroom, really not helping your case here, Kojima. She translates for Marv and tells you he's being held in a detention center north of the tower building. You leave via the elevator that leads to the sewer, you know, that bathroom staple, and head north towards Marv. The pair navigate the sewers, soon finding Dr. Petrovich, who joins. Not long after continuing, he asks you to stop so he can go take a piss, though he calls it his natural desire in the fan translation I was using, which makes it sound way, way grosser. With some time on their hands and Petrovich having something else in his hands, Snake and Natasha talk. The sewers remind her of something her mother said of the Warsaw Uprising in World War II, of having to wade through sewers for days, to the point where you could barely distinguish people under the mud they were covered in. Real-world events are again being implicated to create ties to the series and its themes. You see, Natasha was an Olympic ice skater before joining the STB, the Czechoslovakian state security. This detail starts a trend in these games of characters being experts, or the best in their field, even if that field doesn't directly relate to war. It can feel very cliché, but this is effectively used as a device to demonstrate the black hole of war, how it draws in and destroys everyone around it. This idea is then extended via Natasha's memories of her mother's stories, where people's identities were caked and covered by the grime of battle, also coming through in how she comments on the trio of her, Snake and Petrovich, people from very different backgrounds and places who have all been drawn to Zanzibar land. It's a contradictory aspect of war where all sides are almost unified by the violence and trauma, committed and imparted in the first place by the conflict of borders and separation of people and power. This idea continues as Natasha reminisces on her past relationship with an American named Frank Yeager. She sought asylum in the US to join him but was denied at the last minute, simultaneously disregarded by her own country for giving up skating and trying to leave, her only option being to join the STB. This speech has some cheesy lines and is classically rambling like many other parts of the series, but it picks apart unique consequences of war with surprising deftness and attention to detail, legitimizing its thematic content in the process while further cementing the series' identity. That verbose, rambling structure of speech in the process ascribes a unique tonal character to Metal Gear's writing. Characters often appear vulnerable in sudden, extended bursts, as though hitting their limit of keeping everything in, finally spilling it all to Snake. This creates a dynamic around dialogue, where candidness and truth become symbols of purity and virtue. You see this especially with villains, who with their last breaths explain and justify themselves, as though trying to be absolved and forgiven. This positioning of truth as good via the tone of the writing then naturally juxtaposes thematic threads that run throughout the whole series of people being betrayed by their government, of states lying and those in power deceiving and controlling others by containing or constraining information. I'll get more in depth with this as it crops up throughout the series, but you can definitely see that groundwork being laid here in this rich conversation with Natasha. This dynamic is played upon once the trio leave the sewer and go to cross the bridge to the next building. As Natasha walks over it, a missile destroys it from under her feet. With her dying words, Natasha goes over her regrets, giving Snake a key card and brooch of hers. We see Petrovich being taken away before Grey Fox enters, controlling Metal Gear. Natasha's honesty has been immediately exploited by someone in power who, as a former ally, is betraying Snake in the process. Although we're still in pursuit of Marv, this sort of development is what's really been needed to inject some life and urgency into the game. This sequence is surprisingly effective considering the time of release, and as I touched on is really emblematic of the series' strengths overall. With renewed vigour, Snake takes Holly's advice and goes looking for a hang glider so he can get across to Building 2. What follows is a whole lot of backtracking. The benefits of better level design and more memorable moments pay off as remembering where everything is becomes easier. Additionally, you can pick up red, blue and green key cards that consolidate 1 to 3, 4 to 6 and 7 to 9 respectively, so switching amongst them in your inventory isn't as bad. It's still not good either, just not as bad. After heating up Natasha's brooch to turn it into a key, you can pick up a cassette of the Zanzibar National Anthem. Using this, you can force guards to stop and salute and easily get by, picking up the hang glider, also proving that patriotism is dumb and stupid. Hang gliding across is ascribed appropriate weight, triumph and build up via a dedicated cinematic and piece of music. You're entering the final stretch of the game and making it past the barrier that Grey Fox, an old ally, put up in front of you. The same place where Snake witnessed the death of a recent friend. He's alone again and you're back in completely uncharted territory. The progress made so far is palpable, but it also looks rather familiar. Snake sneaking through on his own, never quite knowing what's around the corner. That promise is unfortunately not taken advantage of by the game. Gameplay devolves and resembles Metal Gear 1 in many ways, where the path to progress becomes bizarre and nonsensical in a way that's less fun and more, well, shit. The best example is picking up 2 animal eggs. They later hatch. One is a snake, the other an owl. The snake will probably have eaten all your rations by the time you find it. You get rid of the snake and then equip the owl, which hoots to trick a guard into thinking it's nighttime, causing him to shut the security gate off, even though the sun's still fucking out. The only positive I can really say about this chunk of Metal Gear 2 is that it does really feel like the whole base is against you. There's a pursuit up some stairs and then this heavily guarded barracks area that create a tonal shift in gameplay to complement that same shift that's happened narratively since Natasha's death. You finally enter Kiemar's room and find that he's recently died, being watched over by Petrovich. The doctor explains that Marv kept a microfilm of the Oilix plans in the circuit board of an MSX cartridge. Holly interrupts as he's found out that Petrovich has been working for Big Boss the whole time. After being rescued from outer heaven, people had moved on from Metal Gear, and so his theories and designs were disregarded. The only one who embraced him and allowed him to work on what he wanted was Big Boss. This development ties in many of the reoccurring ideas of the game. We see Snake being betrayed again, Big Boss exploiting people's alienation to further his goals, and the tide of war pulling people towards it ever more. It also holds up rather robustly under scrutinization. Petrovich's constant focus on Marv makes sense as he wanted to obtain Oilix. Him crossing the bridge first allowed him to be safe within the Building 2 area where Marv is, and so on. This clever scripting sows skepticism amongst the player, causing you to question all your allies and their moves, which plays right into what Snake must be thinking. Petrovich finally tries to take Natasha's brooch from you, as when cooled down it forms the key to Marv's locker. Fortunately, a few remote-controlled missiles will get him off your back. After cooling the brooch down to then collect the cartridge, Petrovich ekes out some final words. He tells you that Metal Gear, much like its early iteration, can be destroyed by using explosives on its legs. Grey Fox then opens a pit that Snake falls down, and you enter the north door to finally face Metal Gear. It's a really exhilarating encounter, not terribly difficult, but quite fun and climactic. Having Grey Fox pilot Metal Gear feels like a culmination of lots of what the game discusses. War and the destruction it sows thanks to government and bureaucracy pulls Grey Fox in once more, this time causing him to pilot this mix of man and machine. This conflict is dehumanizing and cruel, no matter if Big Boss was able to give these people purpose. This outlandish fight is informed by the material conditions of the people involved. It's a climax that, true to the series' optimism, Snake is able to come out on top of, doing away with Metal Gear and the man who betrayed him with a few grenades and his own 2 feet. I am getting a little ahead of myself though, as Fox doesn't die with Metal Gear, as you must face him in hand-to-hand combat. This fight is much more frustrating on a gameplay level, but still narratively poignant. Snake is having to come face to face with a person of his past, someone who killed the most human and honest connection he'd seemed to make thus far in Natasha. There's power and motivation in this encounter. It's quite rich and fleshed out for the time. Of course, this also allows the game to hone in on the personal relationship much more. Beating the shit out of each other is almost how they say goodbye, showing each other respect despite their differences. This investment in intimacy is doubled down as it's revealed that the Frank Jaeger Natasha loved was in fact Grey Fox himself. Grey Fox is a symbol for all of Metal Gear 2's themes, and so despite the clunky hand-to-hand combat, it feels incredibly important and meaningful, a real testament to what this game does so well. With one last punch, Grey Fox is sent to the floor. At the last minute, the scope expands, as Fox reveals that Big Boss helped him while fighting in Vietnam, pushing back against the discrimination he faced as someone who was only half white. That's where his loyalty to Big Boss sprung from. We've seen repeatedly how Metal Gear 2 allows each person the dignity of an explanation. This not only ties into the game's unique tone of writing, as touched on, but shows an empathetic and nuanced observation of the idea of war, at a time where games saw it merely as an easy setting to plaster gameplay mechanics on top of. Fox ultimately perishes on the battlefield, in loyalty to the man who saved his life twice, and at the hands of the man who looked up to him. It's hard not to be affected on some level by the poetry of it all. There's only one thing left to do. Snake enters the next room to face Big Boss. Fittingly, Metal Gear, the namesake of the series, isn't the final boss, but a single person is instead. This continues as you now have no weapons or items at your disposal thanks to the explosion of Metal Gear. Just like the beginning of the first and second game, all items must be procured on site. This makes for a really interesting boss fight gameplay-wise, one that's prolonged but not dull, acting as a reminder of how far your journey took you, emphasizing the sense of finality. Additionally, this fight in a sense endorses Big Boss's thesis. He believes that soldiers are tainted by war and will always need a battlefield in order to have a purpose. Here that rings true, as Snake, someone who wants to be rid of Big Boss, and by extension the ideology he represents, feels most at home procuring resources around the arena in order to come out on top. Even for its biggest, most unapologetic villain thus far, the game extends its sympathy towards Big Boss, validating his theory while also tragically dooming the series' protagonist, something that will become obvious as we cover later games. Despite the fact that Snake, and by extension the player, is essentially made to be a thematic device for this fight, the characterization of each still shines through. Big Boss wields a massive machine gun while dressed in put-together military garb, while Snake uses a scrappy homemade flamethrower in his well-worn sneaking suit. You can see the juxtaposition in how each embraced or resisted the call of war and the battlefield. Big Boss has given in, sees it as inevitable, while Snake tries to resist it and palm it off for a little longer. This embrace of war is punished, as though Big Boss tries to get that final monologue out, it's in vain, burning to death while his words turn to ashes. With his mission complete, Snake begins to leave the complex, soon running into Holly, fending off guards as they make their way to a landing zone to be picked up. The helicopter takes off and crosses the sunset as the credits roll. Snake can finally put the nightmares of the past 3 years behind him. Once the credits are done, Campbell asks Snake if he'll rejoin Foxhound, but he's refused. The Colonel inserts the MSX cartridge to see if it's the real thing, and notices that his signature is right there on the splash screen. The 0.1 kilobytes of VRAM, when reversed, spells Kyo Marv. The game is what saved them, and looking back, it's hard not to apply it to Kojima's path, where he saw games as the medium to finally express himself and find a voice. They're his battlefield, and he's been drawn back into it for over 30 years since. These first two titles are very much about growth. Metal Gear 1's focus on stealth gameplay of avoiding conflict would prove to be very influential, along with other stealth titles like Wolfenstein, helping the medium grow. However, the evolution and change can best be seen internally. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake manages to refine a formula and set of mechanics while at the same time adding depth to what remains. Additions like the radar and crawling show a keen understanding of what did and didn't work in the original game, with these new ideas creating inroads for improved level design and structure along the way. In both games, stealth interactions have been well considered and accounted for. The dynamics of gameplay, success and failure are fresh and interesting, and would have been even more so for the time. The sensation of espionage and infiltration is surprisingly rich and engaging. However, there are still sore spots despite the improvements. The critical path can lose steam at times, cooking up absurd stretches of progression that become frustrating, and focusing way too much on backtracking while never quite reconciling how to design a space that works both the first and 8th time you walk through it. Then there's basic quality of life stuff like keyguards that never stack as you'd like, and a control scheme that's effective but also cumbersome at times and unresponsive thanks to lackluster performance. Despite these negatives, the gameplay has positive ramifications beyond itself. The core of stealth is non-violent and informs the pacifistic anti-war theming of the series. There's inherent subversion to the gameplay loop, which is backed up at times by level design and of course the narrative itself. This is where growth becomes palpable once again. Metal Gear 2 would broaden its scope, implicating world politics and a better understanding of historical cause and effect, to plant its story in compelling circumstances. This allows MG2 to wrestle with the consequences of MG1's ideas, things like imperialism, the role bureaucracy and states play in war, and the existential threat nuclear weapons pose. Despite this expansion into geopolitics and its dynamics, Metal Gear 2 remains grounded thanks to its increased focus on character and motivation. Deception, betrayal, purpose and truth are rife throughout the script, and are interspersed amongst a verbose but honest style of writing that affords everyone some semblance of sympathy. Again and again in Metal Gear 2, it makes sure that its priorities are known. People aren't bad, war is, and the systems that encourage and evoke it are. These sentiments feel genuine, and as we saw, seem like they're rooted in Kojima and his background. He was able to inject, for the time, complex ideas into what was often a narratively basic medium, doing so with filmic influence that added weight and legitimacy to the stories he was crafting. These stories were pulling from personal feelings of isolation and loneliness, as well as the history of his homeland, but they weren't definitive. Kojima's and Metal Gear's growth would only continue. These first two entries are surprisingly well fleshed out and are where Metal Gear's identity would be well and truly established. I wouldn't recommend starting with them, but they're essential for fans of the franchise to revisit in order to get a more comprehensive understanding of it. They're fascinating, valuable, ambitious, and emotive time capsules with compassionate hearts hidden under their metal-plated exteriors, which would only get solidified further as the series expanded.